A new round of evacuations underway in Southern California, where the third largest fire in the state's history continues to consume land and homes. Powerful winds now pushing the flames closer to coastal communities northwest of Los Angeles. Hello, everyone. I'm Molly Lyon. Welcome to a new hour of America's News Headquarters.
Molly, good to see you. I'm Kelly Wright, everyone. Officials warning thousands of people in areas near the Thomas fire to get out as flames continue to rapidly spread. And forecasters say high winds this weekend could actually fuel the fire. It's already charred more than 250,000 acres and reduced hundreds of homes to ash. It's also blamed for 2 deaths, including a firefighter. Will Carr is live from Montecito, close to Santa Barbara, California, with an update. Will?
Hey there, Kelly. We just drove into this area, and when you come in, you can see a thick plume of smoke spread across this region. That's because this fire is up in the Los Padres National Forest right now. Now, I want to show you also, we have some helicopters coming in. They're making water dumps. That's because the winds picked up this morning and pushed this fire down towards Montecito and towards Santa Barbara. Now, thankfully, the winds have calmed right now, but the fire has come so close that it's in the hillside behind me. It's a little tricky from a viewer's perspective because it's so smoky up there that you can't see the flames necessarily right now. But the real concern is if those winds pick back up right now, those flames could race down into this community. We've been driving through the streets here. They're doing home and structure protection on just about every home in this community right now. When we were driving in, there was a huge smoke that had plumed throughout this area. It had settled in the streets. Imagine the thickest fog that you've ever seen, and needless to say, residents are worried. Take a listen.
We've been sleeping out on our decks, just watching, not sleeping, just keeping our eyes open, watching, and we thought it was over. We got word that we could come back, and it just lit up this morning.
This fire's been burning for almost 2 weeks, and in the middle of all this, just a couple days ago, we had our first firefighter death. Corey Iverson was 32 years old. We've learned that he died from a mix of burns and from smoke inhalation. There's an investigation into exactly how that played out. He was a father, he had a young daughter, and also a pregnant wife, which shows just how dangerous these conditions can be. Kelly.
Will, that is heartbreaking, and indeed the conditions out there are so dangerous. I understand that people have to be ready at a moment's notice to get out.
Yeah, that's right. And the neighborhood we're in is under mandatory evacuation. The truth is, though, that's only mandatory in name. We've seen some homeowners who have decided to stay. Of course, when they do that, that could be a big hindrance to the firefighters who are racing through these streets trying to save their homes if the flames potentially come down that hillside behind me. So this area evacuated, but we have seen some people sticking around. Kelly.
All right, Will Carr, thanks for the update, and hopefully people will heed the advice from authorities.
You bet.
Molly?
Well, the stars seem to be aligning for Republicans and their tax bill. The House is now poised to pass it during an expected vote on Tuesday, and the Senate could follow suit very shortly after, now that these 2 key senators have flipped in favor of the bill. All of this as President Trump says the bill will help all Americans.
This will be great for jobs. It'll be fantastic for the middle-income people and for jobs. It'll also benefit lots of other things. I mean, we're looking to, if you look at the whole thing, everybody's going to benefit. But I think the greatest benefit is going to be for jobs and for the middle class, middle income.
Caroline Shively is live in Washington with the details on this. Caroline.
Hi to you, Molly. After all the different versions and amendments and changes scribbled in the margins, Republicans have unveiled the absolute final bill last night. The bill keeps 7 tax brackets starting at 10% and going up to 37%. The corporate tax rate is slashed from 35% to 21%. It also repeals Obamacare's individual mandate while retaining a deduction for medical expenses. 5 of those 7 tax brackets are reduced from today's rates, but it's also expected to add $1.46 trillion to the deficit over the next decade. The standard deduction would be nearly doubled, so would the child tax credit. Filers who itemize would lose some deductions, others are capped. Now that one's going to sting for people who use those deductions in high tax states. Republicans are calling this strong middle-class tax relief, but Democrats say the wealthy get the biggest cuts and remind us those individual tax cuts expire eventually, while the business tax cut is permanent.
I'm very excited about this moment. It has been 31 years in the making.
The tax reform bill is a disaster. It helps the wealthiest, most powerful corporations and individuals, and it hurts the middle class.
The House should vote Tuesday, with the Senate likely a day later. The Senate would normally go first, but they're hoping to give the extra time for Senators Thad Cochran and John McCain to get back to work. Both men have been ill. The president has said he wants a tax bill on his desk by Christmas. It looks like Congress will deliver it to him a few days early. Molly?
And Caroline Shively, thank you for keeping tabs on all of that.
All right, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson making a strong statement to North Korea at the United Nations yesterday. Tillerson backing away from statements he made earlier that talks could come even if North Korea continued its nuclear tests. And instead, he doubled down on the White House's position that North Korea must put a stop to its threatening behavior and earn its way back to the negotiating table.
I said earlier this week, a sustained cessation of North Korea's threatening behavior must occur before talks can begin. North Korea must earn its way back to the table. The pressure campaign must and will continue until denuclearization is achieved. We will, in the meantime, keep our channels of communication open.
Our Brian Yennis is live in our New York City newsroom with more details about all of this. Brian?
Hey, good afternoon, Kelly. Look, the question is, what constitutes a sustained cessation of threatening behavior? Can talks only begin after the regime stops firing missiles? If so, how much time needs to go by? Remember, the regime went 75 days without firing a missile before they fired their new ICBM capable of reaching the U.S., squashing any dim hopes that there was an opening there for negotiations. So, the other question is, does North Korea need to prove more, to prove that they're serious about negotiations before the U.S. will sit at the table with them? The mixed messages from the State Department and the White House suggest that Tillerson is more willing to speak to North Korea, while the White House is not. Trump in October said Tillerson was wasting his time speaking to the North Koreans, and earlier this week, a White House official said that the regime must not only refrain from doing missile tests, but also take, quote, sincere and meaningful actions toward denuclearization before negotiations can happen. Tillerson yesterday tried to squash the idea that he and his boss are not on the same page.
The president's policy on North Korea is quite clear, and there's no daylight at all between the president's policy and the pursuit of that policy. And the president, I think, has been very clear that we're going to lead this pressure campaign. We're going to unite the international community, and we're going to keep the pressure as much as we can and increase it where possible.
The Secretary of State urging the world to continue pressuring and sanctioning North Korea in the hopes that it will cripple their economy, leaving them no choice but to come to the negotiating table. This, as there is some concern that Kim Jong-un may be planning another missile launch to mark the 6-year anniversary of his father's death, the late Kim Jong-il, this weekend. Republican Senator, by the way, Lindsey Graham, Kelly, said this week that he believes time is running out. And if nothing changes, he says there's a 30% chance President Trump attacks North Korea first. Kelly.
Wow, that is quite a sobering assessment. Brian Yennis, thank you for that report.
And I'm joined by Niall Gardner, the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation, to talk about this issue top of the line. You know, thanks for joining us. We just heard our reporter Brian Yennis raise really the key question. As Secretary Tillerson has essentially said, there needs to be a lull before discussion can begin. What constitutes a long enough lull for there to actually be discussions? And should we be having discussions with North Korea? Will they make a difference?
Well, clearly, I mean, decades of discussions with North Korea. You've seen talks between the United States, a number of different parties with the North Koreans over the course of 2 decades. These did not actually result in anything, significant in terms of the North Koreans backing away from their nuclear program. The idea that we can sit down and negotiate with one of the most brutal and barbaric regimes in the world is simply an illusion. And there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that going back to the negotiating table with the North Koreans is actually going to deliver anything in terms of concessions from the North Koreans. So the suggestion that we should once again negotiate with this regime, I think, is completely wrong. The right approach certainly has to be to increase the level of pressure on the regime, increase the sanctions, implement the sanctions that are in place, enforce them, and really isolate this regime, bring it to its knees.
Well, certainly it's one of the most heavily sanctioned rogue regime, of course, around the world, and the world community has, to some degree, agreed to help with this, but at the same time, many seem to be continuing with trade. I mean, the United States just imposed sanctions against 13 Chinese and North Korean organizations who were essentially still trading, particularly important commodities like coal, that sort of thing. So do we need the world community's help, and how important is it to get countries like China? It seems the United States believes that China is really part of the key here.
Well, we do need the support of the global community. Unfortunately, I think China and Russia are both dragging their feet. The United States the president actually implemented an executive order back in September sanctioning Chinese companies who are assisting with North Korea's nuclear program. We need to enforce those sanctions. The Chinese, unfortunately, are not going to do anything unless we actually sanction those Chinese companies that are assisting the North Korean regime. At the same time, the Russians are being deeply unhelpful. They're actually employing a large number of North Koreans as de facto slave labor, actually, and they are in fact assisting with the North Korean economy. At the end of the day, the United States has to lead here, and the United States must actively enforce sanctions, not only against the North Korean regime, but also against all of those who are aiding and abetting this regime. So we need to see the enforcement of existing sanctions against North Korea, and we do need to see the expansion of sanctions against North Korea as well. But the reality remains that both Moscow and Beijing, that both have been very unhelpful with regard to the North Korean threat, and both countries, frankly, have been aiding and abetting the North Koreans.
I want to talk a little bit about the increasing danger that appears to be occurring. Defense Secretary James Mattis said on Friday that this newest missile that was launched is not a capable threat to the United States, but at the same time, we have seen the country make strides in their technology, in their advancement. When does the threat become capable?
Well, we have seen a significant advance in terms of North Korean missile capability this year. We've seen a number of successful missile launches by the North Koreans. It's only a matter of time before the North Koreans are able to strike against the United States. So we should be absolutely clear here. The North Koreans pose an imminent threat to the United States. North Korea has to be prevented from having the capability of firing an intercontinental ballistic missile against the United States, carrying a nuclear warhead. And so the stakes are extremely high at this time, and North Korea does pose an immense, grave threat to the United States and, of course, to US allies in the region, significantly, of course, South Korea and Japan, but other allies as well.
When we talk about how quickly they're advancing, the world community, clearly the United States, has attempted to be a leader in this at the international level and at the UN. Is there another world power that has stepped up to the stage that we can rely on?
Well, the answer is simply no. I think this is a moment when American leadership really does matter. And at the end of the day, if the United States does not lead, no one else is going to lead. And you do have a number of major global actors, in particular the Russians and the Chinese, who are cooperating, even collaborating with North Korea. So American leadership really does matter. And the United States, as a world superpower, must do all it possibly can to prevent North Korea from emerging as a nuclear weapons power that can threaten the United States and its allies. And this is certainly a time of tremendous gravity and a time for bold, robust U.S. leadership.
We will see what happens. Niall Gardiner, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
It's the Senate saga that just won't end. A defiant Roy Moore refusing to concede to Democrat Doug Jones. How the embattled candidate is hoping to recoup some votes Plus, a Kansas congressional hopeful finding herself embroiled in controversy, why she's dropping her bid for a seat in the House.
A shooting in Los Angeles sends 5 people to the hospital, including a young girl. It happened last night. The LAPD says one suspect opened fire from a vehicle, striking 4 men and grazing a little girl. Witnesses say they heard about 10 gunshots. Investigators are not sure what led to the shooting.
The president and others have called on him to concede, but Roy Moore isn't backing down. Democrat Doug Jones beat Moore by about 20,000 votes, but a defiant Moore, well, he's refusing to accept those results. I'm joined now by Roll Call politics reporter Bridget Bowman. Bridget, thanks for joining us this afternoon. And I got to ask you from the outtake, what do you say about this entire race and the unusual aspects of it?
Thanks, Kelly. Well, it certainly was a unique race. I was down in Alabama for about 5 days leading up to the election, and it was quite a wild ride covering this race from starting several months ago. In terms of, as you mentioned, Roy Moore refusing to back down, this is sort of in line with his past behavior. Remember, he was removed not once but twice from the state Supreme Court. One for defying a federal order to remove a statue of the 10 Commandments from the courthouse, and again for ordering federal judges not to comply with the Supreme Court's same-sex marriage decision. So this is sort of not entirely surprising that he's taking this stance, and actually last night his campaign sent out another fundraising email for what they're calling an election integrity fund to look at potential voter fraud. The Secretary of State in Alabama has said that he hasn't seen any evidence of this and that he doesn't think a certification will actually shift the results here.
Well, having said all of that, what's left for Roy Moore to do? You were talking about a wild ride. I recall him getting on his horse to ride to the polls to actually cast the vote for himself, obviously. And one would arguably say, is it time for him to ride the horse off into the sunset?
Well, certainly President Trump and others are urging him to do so. Trump, as you'll recall, endorsed Roy Moore, supported him, and even he is saying you should, step aside. The president did also call Doug Jones after he won, and the two talked about finding common ground. So it seems like he's definitely facing pressure to back down, but he faced similar pressure to step aside as the nominee after these sexual misconduct allegations came out, and he refused to do so. So it seems like this is going to go right until certification is complete, which is expected to be at the beginning of January.
Bridget, let me ask you, you observed Roy Moore throughout this campaign. How would you define his personality? Obviously, he's one who's very confident about his abilities and defiant when he feels threatened, and then he talks about his faith as well. How do all those factors weigh in? Because if you're talking about your faith as he does, there's also a thing called grace, and he could gracefully bow out and concede so that the state of Alabama and its voters can move forward with Doug Jones as their senator for the next 2 years.
That's an interesting point, and certainly the word that you use, defiant, is a really, I think, something that certainly captures him. He is someone that often talks about his faith. He, throughout the campaign, would often go to churches, and the church network, as his campaign argued, was a key factor in his ground game. He would often talk about how the founding fathers and how religion is part of the founding of this country. But as you mentioned, it was interesting that certain evangelical Christians were also part of his base. So we'll see it sort of our Alabamians pressuring him to step aside, but it looks like this could be resolved in a couple weeks or so.
All right, so let's look beyond Roy Moore for just a moment here. With the people of Alabama that you got to know and meet throughout your reporting, has this in any way divided the state? Have they been able to come together? Because for all intents and purposes, this was a bruising campaign for the people of Alabama because of Roy Moore's position on a number of things. Black voters, white voters, have you been able to see them come together and say, we are Alabama and we will roll forward with building our nation as well as our state?
Well, I think there's certainly a divide between those who were adamantly backing Roy Moore, who didn't believe the allegations, and those who were supporting Doug Jones. And it was interesting to actually talk to Republicans and independents who were either supporting Jones or writing someone in, that this was sort of a key part of their argument, that they wanted to show the country that Alabama doesn't accept what Roy Moore was standing for and wouldn't accept someone accused of these allegations to represent them in the U.S. Senate. I think it'll be interesting to see how Doug Jones navigates this. He, of course, didn't win with a majority of voters. He won about 49%. So he mentioned at a press conference after the election that he wants to represent all Alabamians, even those who don't agree with them and with him. And he pledged to travel throughout the state to listen to those that he doesn't agree with and to try and forge a common bond. Doug Jones often said on that campaign trail, there are more that unites Alabamians than divides them, and he's going to try and move that forward as he comes to the Senate.
In doing so, he'll have to also get involved in people who are very adamant about right to life. Is he willing to, as far as you know, is he willing to cross that bridge and find some common ground other than his previous position?
Right. So he has said that he supports the current status quo when it comes to this issue. And this was a big issue and one that raised a lot of questions as to whether or not he could win, whether pro-life Republicans could support him in the end or would write in a candidate, leaving that option open. So I think it'll be interesting to see, especially if there's another Supreme Court opening, how that issue plays into his decision and what the reaction from Alabamians is.
It's a lot left on the plate here, and in order for Doug Jones to go forward and possibly win, and when he's up for re-election, it's going to be very interesting to see how he will play all of this out and if he can really reach out and find some consensus among all of the people in Alabama. But we thank you for weighing in on this, Bridget, and best of everything to you in the coming new year. By now, I can say to you, Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Okay. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Trump transition team leveling new complaints about Robert Mueller and his Russia investigation. Details on that next. Hey, Fox News alert. Officials from the Trump transition team penning a new letter to high-ranking lawmakers accusing Russia Special Counsel Robert Mueller's office of wrongdoing, claiming it inappropriately obtained sensitive documents, some of which they say were protected under attorney-client privilege. Garrett Tenney is following this developing story for us now, live from the White House. Garrett.
Well, Molly, we're still going through this letter, but what we can tell you is that we have learned that the Trump transition team, today, an attorney for that team sent a letter to congressional leaders alleging that Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team acted inappropriately, is how they're wording it, in obtaining materials that belonged to the transition. Now, in that letter to committees in the House and Senate that are responsible for government oversight, Attorney Corey Langhofer claims Mueller's team intentionally went around the transition to obtain the transition's private materials, including privileged communications. Now, Mueller's team allegedly did that through the General Services Administration, or GSA. During the transition period, it was the GSA that provided office space and supplies to the transition team, and also notably hosted the team's email services. Now, part of that agreement is that any computers or communications are secure. But in August, the transition team claims that the special counsel requested copies of the emails, laptops, cell phones, and other materials belonging to more than a dozen top transition team members who were largely responsible for national security and policy issues. And that the GSA then provided those materials to Mueller's team without notifying the transition, and it did so without filtering or redacting privileged material, some of which is protected by presidential privilege and attorney-client privilege. Now, the transition team claims this move sets a precedent that could allow future presidential transitions to have either private records misappropriated by government agencies, and it is now requesting Congress to take steps to prevent that from happening. We are also told that officials familiar with the investigation are concerned that Robert Mueller's team may have violated the Fourth Amendment in obtaining these records, and that is something that congressional officials are now going to be looking at as well. Molly?
Man, it is busy there on Capitol Hill. Garrett Tenney, thank you with the latest from the White House.
You got it.
And all of this coming in the middle of a growing feud with the FBI and the Justice Department. Let's bring in Michael Tobin, former senior aide to Senator Chuck Schumer, and John Jordan, Republican campaign strategist. There's so much going on. What do you guys say when on the surface of what we've just heard from Garrett Tenney?
It really is a delicious irony that we're discussing email servers.
A delicious irony.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a delicious irony. We're talking about email servers in the context of the Trump administration, given what candidate Hillary Clinton dealt with and ultimately, I believe, sank her candidacy at the end. And it all connects up. Just like former FBI Director Comey was doing the right thing and protecting the FBI as an institution and as an important institution and law enforcement institution in American government by reopening the email investigation so close to the election. In this case, Mueller and folks looking into what may or may not have happened with the Trump administration and Russian officials are also protecting the institution of the FBI and law enforcement. So I don't see anything good coming out of this feud unless the president thinks that there's some rhetoric to shore up his base.
What happens to the FBI going forward?
Well, first of all, here we have the Mueller investigation is doing a fantastic job of blowing up its own credibility. And the president is actually on the side of a growing majority of the American people. There's a poll that came out, a Harvard CAPS poll done by a Clinton pollster, hardly friends of the president, that shows 63% of the American public believe that the Mueller investigation is not being truthful with Congress and the American people, and 54% believe that the Mueller investigation is compromised and can't be objective. And this is the same poll that shows the president with a 36% approval rating. So facts are stubborn things. And the administration is clearly on the right side of this, and that's kind of why they piled on the FBI yesterday, because the credibility of this investigation is just imploding.
So if that's imploding, what does it say about the fabric of America then if we can't, or as the president says, the FBI is in tatters, and at one point he's putting down the leadership of the FBI, but then going to rank and file law enforcement members saying, I am with you, I am your greatest advocate and supporter. So the president going so far as to actually make some changes within the FBI as he has vowed to do. We're at a juncture in our country right now, and I know the president, when he was campaigning, he talked about draining the swamp. Is the swamp in our very own Justice Department as it relates to the FBI, men and women who have vowed to serve and protect the citizens of this country?
I'd have to say not. These are law enforcement professionals. We're well past the Hoover years where it was a political institution that was in some cases undermining other branches of government. I don't think there's anything to be gained by this fight, and it's a fight he need not have, given that the Republican Congress and administration are poised to have what they would insist, I might disagree in certain respects, a tremendous victory in tax code reform. So why do this at all? I'm not sure, unless it is to cast aspersions and undermine any conclusion the special investigator may find, again, concerning these troubling campaign allegations.
But as you know, just a minute, as you know, we're in an environment that is very politically toxic right now. If you're talking about Swamp Thing, we got something going on here that's a mess, and people are trying to sort it out, and you've got the American people watching all of this, and they're throwing their hands up and they're saying, what the heck's going on with our country? And we've got this thing about collusion. There's been no proof of collusion. We've got this thing about the special counsel. Should the president fire the special counsel? Should the attorney general step in? There's just a lot going on, and the American people are scratching their heads saying, give me something tangible to hold on to.
Well, given this president really should be a natural ally of law enforcement, it does seem like there's a lot of explaining to do across the board, and maybe folks and voters are thinking of pox on all their houses, and they'll pay attention to something else. And I'm sure the president hopes will be his tax code reform win.
All right, and
well, the leadership of the Justice Department isn't apolitical. There is a cadre of entrenched bureaucrats and political appointees, holdovers from the previous administration, that are a distinct animal from rank and file law enforcement, rank and file FBI agents. So there's a real disconnect between the two. The president is supportive of the rank and file street agents who do the work of law enforcement day in and day out, versus the swamp things at the top of the DOJ, which we're seeing with Bruce Orr and so forth. I mean, just revelation after revelation. Interestingly, the poll I just cited was done in November, weeks before all of the revelations about Bruce Orr and Peter Strzok. So those numbers are only going south like a duck in winter now.
I like how you say that. But the bottom line is, Michael and John, is that the American people want to move forward with their nation. They want to be able to get beyond this. And this is a malaise that's on the country right now. So what do you say to the president? What do you say to the Justice Department, to the FBI, to Congress about cleaning up the mess so that people can move forward?
Am I thinking again? I know I'm going to sound like a broken record,
That's
but
okay.
I don't see enormous problems at the FBI. I think if the president wants to use language in criticizing law enforcement professionals, the same language he uses for criticizing other institutions and certain media outlets, to me it's a bridge too far. But again, he may be thinking the calculus is to shore up his base. And folks that, as you said, so aptly are tired of the overall malaise and swamp. I personally just don't see it.
John?
Well, the American people are with the president on this, and there's a real difference. The political appointees at the Justice Department are not real law enforcement. Real law enforcement is actually with the president, and you saw that with the ovation that he got at the FBI Academy at Quantico yesterday.
All right, so there we have two divergent views, which is always healthy in America, but we hopefully can find some common ground. I think the common ground I hear from both of you is that we still trust the men and women who serve in the FBI.
I'd agree with that.
Yes, we do.
Oh, I got an agreement. Okay. On that note, I'll end
How about that?
I'll end it while we're safe. We agree that the FBI is serving the country well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
All
Happy
right.
holidays.
All right. Same to you.
Well, Congress could vote as early as next week on a final version of a GOP tax plan. So when can Americans expect to see more money in their paychecks? One Republican lawmaker joins us with his take next.
Patrick.
The Pentagon, like many of us, has apparently been trying to answer the age-old question: are we alone in the universe? The New York Times reporting the Defense Department spent $22 billion a year for 5 years on the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, in which officials investigated U.S. military reports of UFOs. The Pentagon never before acknowledged the program, which it now says started in 2007 and shut down in 2012. But some officials tell the Times the program continues, even after its funding ended.
Congressional Republicans cross another hurdle on the way to the finish line for that tax reform. Lawmakers releasing the final version of the GOP tax bill. They plan to muscle that measure on through Congress next week, and President Trump could sign it into law by Friday. Joining me now is Congressman Robert Pittenger of North Carolina, a member of the House Committee on Financial Services. Congressman, thanks for being here.
Hey, Molly, how are you?
I'm doing great. Let's kick off with this. I would say congratulations. I want to wait for the ink to hit the paper, want to wait for it to be dry. But Republicans and the White House as well seem like they are just on the cusp of this big victory, this legislative win that they have wanted. Why should the American people be excited about this moving forward into the new year?
It's transformational. I think most Americans really don't even know what to expect. You've got to be in your 50s or 60s to really have a perspective of what took place during the Reagan tax cuts. So folks in their 20s and 30s and 40s, all they know probably is Keynesian theories of government intervention. Market-driven economies and low taxes are what is really going catapult this economy and create jobs. This is a jobs bill. It's going to put more cash back in the hands of the American people, but really it's going to put capital in the hands of businesses to be able to expand and create jobs.
Well, let's talk about some of the concerns that have been raised. Really, the one big one that seems to have gathered so much attention is the deficit and the analysis that shows that $1 trillion or more could be added to the deficit. What do you say to that?
Well, that's a static model. Well, that's a model that really doesn't enjoin growth. And this is a growth tax cuts. And for every 1% that you add to the GDP, you will increase the revenue back to the federal coffers by nearly $3 trillion. So you can't just look at the silo of tax cuts as they are. You have to see the reality of the growth that comes from that, new jobs, and frankly, as a result, revenue back to the federal coffers from those tax receipts.
And certainly people want to see those new jobs. You're excited about this bill. A lot of your colleagues are excited about the bill. But some of the recent polling shows that some might not be as excited. A Quinnipiac University national poll coming out December 13th. Only 16% of the American voters say the tax plan will reduce their taxes. 44% say will increase their taxes. 65% say that the wealthy will benefit the most from the tax plan. So when it comes to messaging, those skeptics, when will they see the money in their pockets? When will the middle class feel the difference?
Well, before the Reagan tax cuts in the polling, only 18% of the people felt that they were going to get a tax cut. And as I said a minute ago, most folks really never experienced those tax cuts that are here today. You've got to be in your 50s to be aware of what materially happened to their own paychecks and to jobs and to the increase in wages. So I think in the February, when people get their paychecks, they're going to start seeing something different. They'll see money, less money taken out of the paycheck.
Well, by February, so that would be good news for a lot of folks. Certainly, that would make a lot of people happy in that post-Christmas era. You know, and speaking of Christmas, I was at the Salvation Army earlier this week, and I had a chance to speak with a lady there, an older lady who had packed her tiny little car to the brim with toys, was bringing them in, and she was concerned about the charitable tax credit. What would you say to folks that have that concern here in this season of giving?
Yes, ma'am. They are continued. We continue our charitable deductions in this bill, as we had the mortgage deductions up to $750,000 for 2 homes. We have the deductions for health care, for student education, for graduate education. We have many deductions in there that have been preserved for the American people.
You know, you've also talked about, said, you have to be in your 50s to understand and remember. And this is historic in the sense that we haven't seen changes like this, as you mentioned, since the 80s, since the Reagan era. When we're talking about families, people that are not yet in their 50s, that are in their 20s and 30s and 40s, and they're raising kids, we know that Marco Rubio kind of won that battle to get the tax credit. What else is in it for that era, for folks that are worried about supporting their young, growing families right now?
Sure. I mean, we doubled the standard deduction. And as you said, we increased double the tax credit to $1,000 to $2,000. So that's real meaningful for them. But really what's truly meaningful is the impact on growing this economy and on jobs. We will be able to, as companies expand, they've got more capital. I've got businesses in my district. I have 8 counties. Some of it's rural, some of it's suburban. But these businesses are very encouraged that they're going to have more capital to be able to expand, and that's job creation. That impacts wages as well. So I think there's a major benefit that's going to come back to every American family.
Congressman, thank you so much for coming on. Merry Christmas to you and Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas. God bless you.
More violent clashes in the West Bank nearly 2 weeks after President Trump's historic decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And the violence not expected to end anytime soon. Ahead, the visit that may ramp up the riots.